Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Emily Schrader, and coming up in today's newscast. The IDF continues the fight against Hamas and announces the opening of a new humanitarian aid route for civilians. Hamas has agreed to a modified framework for hostage release and temporary ceasefire as a deal inches closer. A stabbing attack in Jerusalem this morning injures 2 as the attempted attacks during Ramadan continue. Day 159 of the war in Gaza. The IDF is continuing its offensive against Hamas in Khan Younis in the south and conducted bombardments in central Gaza. Amid the ongoing war, Israel is facilitating new routes to bring humanitarian assistance to Gazan civilians. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
The IDF's 98th Division is continuing its offensive against Hamas in the Khan Younis area of southern Gaza, in the Hamad town residential complex, and in surrounding suburbs. The division's Egoz commando unit battled a 7-man Hamas cell that had been holed up in a building in Hamad. The troops eliminated some of the gunmen before directing an airstrike to kill the others. In one airstrike, the IDF said it eliminated a Hamas terrorist responsible for many rocket attacks on Israel, including on October 7th. The Air Force carried out strikes against Hamas sites in central Gaza's Deir al-Balach, targeting tunnels, missile launching positions, and staging grounds. Also in central Gaza, the IDF said the Nachal Brigade is continuing to battle Hamas operatives in the area. Amid the ongoing warfare, Israel is continuing efforts to facilitate aid to Gazan civilians arriving by land, air, and sea. A World Food Program convoy entered the northern Gaza Strip on a new military road. The UN agency used a new land route to deliver food directly into northern Gaza for the first time in 3 weeks, amid global pressure on Israel to allow more access to the coastal enclave. Israeli officials said it was part of an experimental pilot in order to prevent Hamas from taking over the aid. Shipments were thoroughly inspected by Israeli authorities at the Kerem Shalom border crossing before entering via the Strip's north. Meanwhile, Moroccan food supplies arrived directly at Ben Gurion Airport before being given to the Red Crescent at Kerem Shalom crossing for delivery into Gaza. Rabat's foreign ministry said in a statement that Morocco is the first country to transport humanitarian aid via this unprecedented land route. The U.S. military conducted another airdrop into northern Gaza, along with Jordan's Air Force. A U.S. C-130 dropped approximately 5,280 pounds of food, including rice, flour, pasta, and canned food. And a ship transporting almost 200 tons of food to Gaza left port in Cyprus in a pilot project to open a new sea route for aid to Gaza. The aid ship hopes to dock at a new temporary pier being built in Gaza. The charity ship, Open Arms, was seen sailing out of Larnaca port in Cyprus, towing a barge containing flour, rice, and protein. The 200-mile voyage across the eastern Mediterranean to Gaza with a heavy tow barge could take up to 2 days.
Qatari and Egyptian mediators are now saying that significant progress has been made towards securing a temporary truce between Israel and Hamas that includes the release of hostages. More from ILTV's Rachel Safdie.
The optimism from Qatari and Egyptian mediators follows an extended period of apparent deadlock in the hostage for ceasefire talks. The progress reportedly came following significant pressure placed by Doha on Hamas, warning the terror group that its leaders in Qatar would be forced to leave the country if they didn't change their tune in the negotiations. According to Al Arabiya newspaper, Hamas has accepted a modified version of the latest U.S. proposal, which was based on a framework accepted by Israel during a meeting in Paris last month. Qatar cautioned that there were still issues to be worked out.
The situation is very complicated on the ground. We are not near a deal, meaning that we are not seeing both sides converging on a language that can resolve the current disagreements over the implementation of the deal. But we remain hopeful, and we continue pushing for a deal to happen in the near future.
As currently reported, the three-phase deal would see roughly 40 female, elderly, and wounded hostages released during the initial 6-week phase. soldiers released during a second phase, Palestinian security prisoners would reportedly be released according to a 10-to-1 ratio. U.S. CIA Director William Burns says there is still a possibility of a deal, although many complicated issues remain. While Israel agreed to an original framework in Paris, off which the current proposal under discussion is based, Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet, along with Hamas, will still have to sign off on the final offer, and the Arab mediator says it's unclear whether that will happen.
Well, as this story continues to develop and progress is made towards a temporary ceasefire and the release of dozens of Israeli hostages, ILTV's Rachel Safdie is at the scene at Hostage Square in Tel Aviv, speaking with some of the families. Let's take a look.
Thank you, Emily. I'm here today at the Hostages Square in Tel Aviv, which has become the epicenter of the Bring Them Home campaign, where the families of 134 hostages that are still in Hamas captivity in Gaza fight every day to bring their loved ones home. Back in late November, we saw a deal that brought 105 civilians home, 81 of them Israeli, and in the weeks leading up to Ramadan, we expected to see a deal that would occur by Ramadan, and as we know, that did not happen as Hamas did not accept to the terms. Now we hear that there might be a potential new deal, and I'm here today to talk to some family members of hostages in Gaza. I am now at the Hostages Families Forum with Maayan, whose both grandparents were taken hostage by Hamas on October 7th. How are you today?
It's another day, and yet I'm very hopeful for what's going to come.
So I wanted to ask you regarding the possibility of a hostage deal. How was it to learn that the deal did not happen?
I mean, naturally, it's a little disappointing because we were very hopeful, and yet, as I learned in this time, if something bad happens, you just move forward and you keep your eyes on the goal that we have.
And now, as we've seen, there are reports that there might still be a deal even during Ramadan, even during the next few weeks. How hopeful are you, and how is it to live every day and to wake up every day with your grandfather still not home?
I'm very hopeful. I do think that we are starting to go in a better direction, and I also think, I have to say that we have families that are also believe in Quran and everything. They're also Arabs that are part of the family. So I really do hope that both sides will be able to find their way in this time, because Ramadan can be a time of connection to God and to unity and to being together. And I really hope that both sides will find the way to communicate and to bring this Ramadan into a real holiday of being released and joyful together, and not into destruction.
Thank you so much. I hope your grandfather comes home soon.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is continuing his direct message to the Biden administration that Israel will make its own decisions on the conduct of the war in Gaza. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
Israel elects its government and no one else. That was the message of a very senior but unnamed Israeli official after the release of a U.S. intelligence report that warned Israel will be challenged by Hamas for years to come, and that Netanyahu's coalition may be in danger. The U.S. assessment read, "Distrust of Netanyahu's ability to rule has deepened and broadened across the public from its already high levels before the war, and we expect large protests demanding his resignation and new elections." Speaking virtually to the AIPAC conference in Washington, Netanyahu rejected President Biden's criticism of his conduct of the war and insisted that to win the war, Israel must enter Rafah.
To win this war, we must destroy the remaining Hamas battalions in Rafah. If not, Hamas will regroup, rearm, and reconquer Gaza. And then we're back to square one. And that's an intolerable threat that we cannot accept.
Netanyahu insisted that Israel was fighting the war while avoiding civilian casualties.
We will finish the job in Rafah while enabling the civilian population to get out of harm's way. We've taken measures to minimize civilian casualties that no other army has taken in history.
A senior Israeli official hit back at the U.S. intelligence report, saying those who elect the Prime Minister of Israel are the citizens of Israel and no one else. The comment continued, Israel is not a protectorate of the U.S., but an independent and democratic country whose citizens are the ones who elect the government. We expect our friends to act to overthrow the terror regime of Hamas and not the elected government in Israel.
Well, as relations between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden continue to deteriorate, joining us to discuss the state of U.S.-Israel relations is Gidon Israel, the founder and president of the Jerusalem-Washington Center. Gidon, thanks so much for joining us. Let me start by getting your take on the U.S.'s comments about Netanyahu. Inappropriate or justified?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has done his best to take the U.S.'s stance into consideration throughout the war, but it never seems to be enough. It never seems to be enough, whether it be the humanitarian aid and how the humanitarian aid is given and stopping the operations or pausing them, or it just never seems to be enough. And you ask yourself, what would make the U.S. happy? It seems like the more Netanyahu gives, the more they want from him. And at some point, he has to stand on Israeli interests and push back like he did.
Now let's talk about Biden's approach. Initially very pro-Israel, now perhaps a bit more politically calculated. Is the Biden administration's pressure on Israel related to elections in the U.S. or genuine concern about the transfer of humanitarian aid into Gaza?
Well, I think I kind of don't agree with that premise that in the beginning it's pro-Israel, but now more politically calculated. I think the Biden administration's support for Israel and maybe lack thereof later on in the war is all politically calculated. But I want to mention something important about the U.S. aid to Israel, as it's been brought up that perhaps the Biden administration might use the aid as leverage against Israel. Oftentimes, when people think about the United States aid to Israel, they view it as a manifestation of the United States sympathies towards Israel, or that Israel can't defend itself on its own without the U.S. aid to Israel, be it money coming to Israel, or even it be weapons sales. And I think there's a very important point that is lost in this discussion, and that is that one of the reasons the United States aid to Israel started and became institutionalized was so that Israel would have the means to fight against the Arab countries around it in a conventional way, meaning that since the Muslims outnumber Israel, it can't fight them just using conventional weapons, so it might have to actually introduce non-conventional weapons into its arsenal. The United States aid was meant to prevent such a situation where Israel would have to introduce, let's say, nuclear arms into its arsenal. And there's actually a quote from Amos Rubin, who was Prime Minister Shamir's economic advisor in 1987, where he says exactly this. It's an interview in the Christian Science Monitor. And this fact has also been alluded to throughout the years by, let's say, during the Yom Kippur War, where Ambassador Dinitz says to the United States administration that if an airlift of weapons is not going to arrive in Israel, then Israel will make the appropriate conclusions. Finance Minister Dan Meridor was part of the government in 1996. In an interview to the BBC, he said the same thing. It would be very unwise for the United States to try to use military aid as leverage against Israel. And it's important to know, if the United States wants to go down that path of trying to use military aid as a leverage against Israel, Israel will have to make serious calculations about how they fight wars, and Israel would fight wars in a totally different way. This whole idea of going house to house in Gaza or going to so much ends to try to prevent civilian casualties if Israel knows that it doesn't have the United States back and their willingness to sell them weapons and also aid, Israel will fight its wars in a very, very different way. It will fight quick wars. It will fight wars with overwhelming force, such as the Six-Day War, and it would never, ever have a 4-month war like it has today. So I think when the United States, when we hear about aid being used as leverage, it's important to understand what the implications are.
So essentially what you're saying is that the United States, in fact, their military aid to Israel is actually helping to prevent additional civilian casualties and perhaps even a more bloody war in Gaza. Am I reading you right?
Yes, in a way. The United States is always happy to provide funds for defensive weapons such as the Iron Dome, whether David's Sling, and other things which allow for the possibility of reducing civilian casualties, but also the fact that that Israel knows that it can expect a steady delivery of munitions that it needs. That's what it allows it to fight a more prolonged war and maybe go much slower and go house to house in Gaza. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing for Israel, but that's the fact. Mm-hmm. So when politicians talk about using military aid as leverage against Israel, I'm not sure if all of them understand what the implications of trying to use that against Israel and how Israel would respond if pushed against the wall.
Absolutely. Gidon, we are out of time, but I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing these insights.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Terrorist violence today at the entrance to Jerusalem and in Jenin. In Jerusalem, 15-year-old attacker was neutralized, but not before wounding 2 Israelis. More from ILTV's William Sharon.
According to police, the terror suspect arrived at Road 60 tunnel checkpoint at the southern entrance into Jerusalem on a bicycle. Security forces attempted to question him. He drew a knife and stabbed them. 2 members of the security forces were wounded and taken to hospital with light and moderate injuries. A civilian guard at the checkpoint attempted to physically confront the stabber before IDF troops stationed in the area opened fire at him. Media reports named the attacker as Muhammad Abu Hamad, 15, from the town of El Kadal, close to the checkpoint. His condition has not been announced. The police chief arrived at the scene and spoke of security concerns during Ramadan.
ככל שהרמדאן, יום השישי של הרמדאן, מתקרב, המתח קצת עולה, אנחנו עושים כל שביכולתנו על מנת לאפשר את חופש פולחן הדת לכל המתפללים המוסלמים שיוכלו לבוא ולהתפלל ולקיים את מצוות החג בצורה סדורה ובטוחה, ונעשה כל שביכולתנו על מנת לאפשר את זה, במקביל לשמור על הביטחון של כוחותינו ואזרחי מדינת ישראל.
Meanwhile, the IDF says the troops operating in Samarian city of Jenin opened fire after identifying armed men during a raid. 2 terrorists were reportedly killed in the raid. The army says that during the operations, troops detonated several explosive devices that had been planted and uncovered weapons. 7 wanted Palestinians were arrested in raids across Judea and Samaria overnight.
Well, one of Israel's most veteran politicians, Gideon SAR, has announced a change in course, leaving the National Unity Party of Benny Gantz. ILTV's Ariella Lahiani has the story.
National Unity MK Gideon SAR shook the political world in Israel today after announcing he will leave the National Unity Party of Benny Gantz and is seeking to join the war cabinet himself. SAR was a member of the Likud party until he broke away over differences with Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2020 to form the New Hope party. Ahead of the next round of elections, his party New Hope opted to run together with the National Unity, a more centrist coalition for parties. The war, however, brought out ideological differences, with SAR stating his approach was not being represented by the National Unity position in the war cabinet. In his statement, SAR specifically noted, "We must not reduce the military pressure and slow down the progress in destroying the forces of Hamas and its rule," adding that he represents a statesmanship right, a position which he claims is not represented in the war cabinet. According to Hebrew media reports, Netanyahu's team was pleased with SAR's hawkish position on the war and had recently expressed a desire to reabsorb him into Likud's alliance.
Well, the question now is, what will Prime Minister Netanyahu do with MK Gidon SAR's request? And here to speak with us about the political situation is JNS Jerusalem Bureau Chief Alex Tryman. Alex, thanks for being with us today, and every day you're with us here at ILTV. What do you think of SAR's move to join the war cabinet, split from the National Unity Alliance? Is Gantz, the former chief of staff of the army himself, really that dovish?
Well, first of all, SAR did not join the war cabinet. He's requested to join the war cabinet. That's a move that's being blocked by Benny Gantz. But SAR's leaving the alliance with Gantz is a bit of a political earthquake, and it sends a very strong signal to the Israeli public that Benny Gantz is much more hawkish than he would like to position himself, or he wants the voters of Israel to think that he is. SAR saying that he has significant differences with Benny Gantz on the way the war is being handled, and that if he was in the war cabinet, that Israel will be taking much tougher stances, being much more aggressive against Hamas than Gantz or Eisenkot or even probably the Americans would like.
Now, do you think this change in political posturing to align himself more on the right after repeated lack of success in elections, less than he would like to see, or is this truly about the policy and management of the war?
Well, I think it's both. Israel is in a major existential crisis, which is this war, and Israel needs a decisive victory for many reasons, including its diplomatic standing and also domestically in terms of setting the future for Israel as a secure future. And so political differences are secondary to whether or not Israel wins the war at this moment. But of course, all politicians are looking for what might be the day after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And previously, SAR, as the number 2 in the Likud, had seen himself as a natural successor. He thought that perhaps he could have defeated Netanyahu by changing ranks and moving together with Gantz. Now, as Gantz continues to be polling as the possible successor, SAR is making a move and potentially shifting back towards the right, towards the Likud, seeing himself as the one that might be able to take over if the country moves, as it is expected, even further to the right in a future election.
Now, what is the likelihood that we're going to see Prime Minister Netanyahu accept this request and add SAR to the war cabinet?
Well, we saw Gantz last week go to Washington, D.C. To have meetings in the White House with Kamala Harris, and then went to the UK where he met with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. That trip happened without the approval of the Prime Minister. In fact, it happened with the explicit disapproval of the Prime Minister, essentially an act that Netanyahu would consider to be completely insubordinate. But Netanyahu didn't have any options and wasn't able to discipline Gantz, because if he disciplined Gantz and Gantz left the war cabinet and the government, Netanyahu would be left with a narrow right-wing government. Now Netanyahu has options, and I think that this holds Gantz in check. It keeps Gantz closer to Netanyahu, because if Gantz acts in a way that would be considered insubordinate in the future, Netanyahu can simply fire him from the war cabinet, kick him out of his government, and instead turn to SAR and to bring SAR's 4 seats into the coalition and create a broad right-wing government instead of a narrow right-wing government.
Now, Itamar Ben-Gvir has already stated that he thinks he should be in the war cabinet. Will Gidon SAR's move or potential move create more problems within an already fragile coalition? And what do you think Netanyahu should do with Ben-Gvir in this circumstance?
Well, I don't think Ben-Gvir is going to get into the war cabinet. The international community already has their sights and their criticism set on Ben-Gvir. If Netanyahu would bring Ben-Gvir into the war cabinet, I think that would set off a firestorm of international diplomacy that Netanyahu really doesn't want. That said, if SAR would replace Gantz and Eisenkot in the war cabinet, that would already shift the makeup of the war cabinet further to the right, and that would be a war cabinet that would probably be closer in line to what Ben-Gvir would want. So certainly a lot of political posturing. I think Netanyahu wants to try to hold things as they are, maintain the status quo, but he certainly has a lot more options. He's seen his primary challenger, Benny Gantz, weakened, and in a way it very much does strengthen the position of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Well, we're out of time, but thank you, as always, Alex, for your insights.
Thank you so much.
Let's take a look at the weather forecast. Cloudy skies are expected around most of the country tonight, with lows averaging around 13 degrees Celsius or 56 Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow we will get some clear skies, seeing highs of about 16 degrees Celsius or 62 degrees Fahrenheit. That's all for today's news. For more updates from Israel on all your devices, check out our ILTV channels, subscribe to our ILTV newsletter, and don't forget to check out our new and improved website, ILTV.tv, with all the latest news from the heart of the State of Israel. I'm Emily Schrader. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.